March 23, 1944. 27,000 feet above the Rhineland, where the air temperature measured 40 degrees below zero, Lieutenant Klaus Fischer adjusted his oxygen mask inside the cramped cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190 Anton-8. Below him, the distinctive contrails of American bombers stretched across the winter sky like white chalk lines drawn on grey canvas. Fischer had flown 114 combat missions. He had accumulated 19 confirmed victories against British and American aircraft. He understood the mathematics of aerial combat as well as any pilot in Jagdgeschwader II, and those mathematics, based on 3 years of combat experience over Europe, told him one simple truth: twin-engine fighters could not dogfight with single-engine aircraft at high altitude. They were too heavy, too sluggish, too vulnerable. Then he spotted them. 8 aircraft climbing rapidly through 25,000 feet, their distinctive twin-boom silhouettes unmistakable even at 5 miles distance. P-38 Lightnings from the 55th Fighter Group, 8th Air Force, escorting the bomber formation toward targets deep in Germany. Fischer smiled beneath his mask. The Americans had sent their twin-engine fighters to the one place where they would be most vulnerable, the thin, freezing air above 25,000 feet, where his Focke-Wulf's BMW 801 radial engine delivered its best performance. He pushed his control stick forward and began his diving attack, confident in the tactical doctrine that had served the Luftwaffe since 1940. Twin engine equals vulnerable in air-to-air combat. What happened in the next 7 minutes would shatter every assumption Klaus Fischer held about high-altitude combat. The P-38 he attacked did not behave like a twin-engine fighter. It turned inside his Focke-Wulf, with a radius that seemed impossible for an aircraft weighing over 10 tons. It climbed when it should have descended. It maneuvered when it should have fled, and when Fischer finally broke off the engagement and dove for the safety of lower altitude, he carried with him a lesson that would force the Luftwaffe to revise every tactical manual written about fighting American twin-engine fighters. The P-38 Lightning, which German intelligence had dismissed as unsuitable for high-altitude combat, had just proven that above 25,000 feet, it could outturn the Focke-Wulf 190. The revelation would cost the Luftwaffe dearly. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 6 months earlier, in September of 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence officers at JAG Division headquarters in Diemen, Netherlands, received the first detailed reports about the P-38 Lightning entering service with the 8th Air Force over Germany. Reconnaissance photographs showed an aircraft that violated every principle German fighter tacticians considered essential for success in aerial combat. The Lightning weighed 10,400 pounds empty. Fully loaded with ammunition, fuel, and external tanks, it could exceed 15,000 pounds. By comparison, the Focke-Wulf 190 Anton weighed just over 7,000 pounds empty. The German fighter pilots who reviewed these intelligence reports reached an obvious conclusion: an aircraft that heavy could not possibly maneuver effectively at high altitude, where thin air reduced lift and increased turn radius for every fighter. This assessment seemed validated by every piece of evidence available to German intelligence in late 1943. The Messerschmitt Bf 110, Germany's own twin-engine heavy fighter, had proven catastrophically vulnerable in dogfights over Britain in 1940. Unable to turn with single-engine Spitfires and Hurricanes, the Zerstörer units suffered losses so severe that by the end of 1940, the Bf 110 had been withdrawn from daylight fighter operations over Britain entirely. Soviet twin-engine fighters had fared no better. French twin-engine designs had been swept from the sky in weeks during the Battle of France. Even the British Beaufighter, while effective as a night fighter, was considered easy prey for German day fighters whenever it ventured into contested airspace during daylight hours. Therefore, when detailed intelligence reports about the P-38 reached Luftwaffe tactical planning staffs, the analysis followed predictable patterns. The Lightning's twin-boom design created massive drag. The distance between engines meant asymmetric thrust problems if one engine failed. The centerline weapons pod was far from the pilot's natural sightline, creating aiming difficulties. Most significantly, the aircraft's weight, nearly 50% greater than a Focke-Wulf 190, would make it lethargic in turning combat, especially at altitudes above 20,000 feet where air density decreased dramatically. Major Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter leaders with over 150 combat missions, reviewed the intelligence assessments at Jagdgeschwader 77 headquarters. His evaluation echoed the consensus view. The Americans had built an effective long-range escort platform, perhaps useful for reconnaissance work, but certainly not a fighter that could challenge the Bf 109 or Focke-Wulf 190 in genuine aerial combat at bomber escort altitudes. This assessment reached operational units through official tactical bulletins distributed in October and November of 1943. German fighter pilots received specific instructions for engaging P-38s, attack from stern and above, where the twin-engine fighter's limited maneuverability made it vulnerable. Force the Lightning into turning combat, where its weight would become a fatal liability. If attacked, dive away. Knowing the American aircraft's compressibility problems made high-speed dives dangerous for Lightning pilots. These tactical directives reflected 3 years of combat experience. They represented the accumulated wisdom of the most successful fighter force in the world. They were based on sound aerodynamic principles and confirmed by extensive combat testing against every major Allied fighter type. They were also about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The flaw in German tactical thinking stemmed not from faulty logic, but from incomplete information. Luftwaffe intelligence had correctly identified the P-38's weight and twin-engine configuration. They had accurately documented its unusual design features. What they had not discovered, what they could not discover from reconnaissance photographs and fragmentary combat reports, was how Lockheed's engineers had solved the fundamental problems that plagued every other twin-engine. Fighter design, February 1937, Wright Field, Ohio. First Lieutenants Benjamin Kelsey and Gordon Saville sat in a cramped office at Army Air Corps headquarters, drafting a specification that would change aerial warfare. They needed an interceptor capable of reaching 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. No contemporary engine could meet that requirement. Kelsey calculated that only a twin-engine design would provide sufficient power. Clarence Kelly Johnson, a 27-year-old engineer at Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, studied the Army's specification with particular interest. Every other aircraft company pursuing the contract designed conventional twin-engine fighters. Johnson proposed something radically different. Instead of placing engines in the fuselage or mounting them on the wings in traditional nacelles, Johnson positioned them in long booms, extending back from the wings. The pilot would sit in a central pod, containing all weapons, with the empennage connecting the 2 booms behind him. The design offered revolutionary advantages. All guns mounted in the nose, eliminating convergence problems that plagued wing-mounted weapons. Counter-rotating propellers cancelled out torque, providing unprecedented stability. The tricycle landing gear improved visibility during takeoff and landing. Most significantly, the engine's placement in separate booms meant battle damage to one engine would not affect the other's operation. But Johnson's true innovation lay in how he addressed high-altitude performance. The P-38 incorporated turbo superchargers mounted atop each engine, connected to large intercoolers housed initially in the wing leading edges. These systems enabled the Allison V1710 engines to maintain power output at altitudes where normally aspirated engines lost effectiveness. While a Focke-Wulf 190's BMW 801 engine produced its maximum horsepower at sea level and steadily lost power above 20,000 feet, the P-38's turbo-supercharged engines could maintain combat power up to 30,000 feet and beyond. This high-altitude power advantage translated directly into maneuverability. At 25,000 feet, where the Focke-Wulf 190's engine produced perhaps 70% of its rated power, the P-38's engines still delivered close to full output. In turning combat at that altitude, power-to-weight ratio mattered more than absolute weight. The Lightning could pull tighter turns than its raw weight suggested possible, because its engines continued delivering thrust where German engines began gasping for oxygen. Johnson also incorporated Fowler flaps that extended rearward as they dropped, increasing wing area and improving lift. From the P-38F model forward, pilots could deploy these flaps to an 8-degree combat maneuver setting. When deployed during turning combat, these flaps transformed the Lightning's turning radius, allowing it to outturn fighters that theoretically possessed superior maneuverability. German intelligence officers studying reconnaissance photographs in late 1943 could see none of this. They observed twin booms, twin engines, and substantial weight. They applied lessons learned from fighting the Bf-110 and reached conclusions that seemed entirely logical. They never discovered that the Americans had not built another failed twin-engine fighter. They had created something entirely new. November 19, 1942. Skies over Tunisia, North Africa. The morning sun climbed above the horizon as 18 Lightnings from the 1st and 14th Fighter Groups escorted Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses toward targets near Tunis. This was the P-38's first major test in combat against the Luftwaffe. Hauptmann Franz Schiess, leading elements of Jagdgeschwader 53, spotted the American formation at 20,000 feet. His Messerschmitt Bf-109 Gustav carried the combat experience of 140 missions. He had scored 19 victories against British and Soviet aircraft. Now he would face these strange twin-engine American fighters for the first time. Schiess positioned his unit above and behind the P-38s, standard German tactics for engaging twin-engine aircraft. Attack from stern and above, where the slower, less maneuverable twin-engine fighters would be vulnerable. The Bf-109s dove. What happened next shocked every German pilot in the formation. The P-38 pilots spotted the diving Germans immediately. Instead of maintaining formation in a defensive posture as the Bf-110 Zerstörers had done over Britain, the Lightnings broke hard into the attack. They turned inside the diving Messerschmitts with a radius that seemed impossible for such massive aircraft. Schiess found himself looking not at the tail of a lumbering, twin-engine bomber-destroyer, but at the nose of a P-38 pulling lead for a deflection shot. 4 50-caliber Brownings and 1 20mm Hispano cannon, all mounted on the center line, converged their fire with devastating accuracy. Unlike wing-mounted guns that required convergence adjustment, the P-38's nose-mounted weapons delivered concentrated fire at any range. One burst could saw a Bf-109 in half. Schiess pulled hard, his Messerschmitt protesting at the edges of its performance envelope. The American pilot followed, staying inside his turn. Impossible. A 10-ton aircraft should not turn like this, yet the Lightning stayed with him, its pilot using combat flap settings that transformed the aircraft's handling characteristics. Schiess survived that first engagement through skill and experience, but 3 of his pilots did not return to base. In the after-action debriefing, he submitted a combat report that contradicted every assumption German intelligence had made about the P-38. The American twin-engine fighter could maneuver, it could dogfight, and at 20,000 feet, it possessed performance characteristics that made it genuinely dangerous. His report reached Luftwaffe tactical headquarters within 48 hours. Intelligence officers reviewed it with skepticism. Schiess was an experienced pilot, but perhaps he had been surprised by the Americans' tactics. Perhaps the Lightnings had caught his formation at a tactical disadvantage. The report was filed with a notation that further combat experience would clarify the P-38's actual capabilities. Additional reports arrived over the following weeks. On December 4, 1942, Lightnings engaged Bf-109s over Bizerte. The Americans claimed 3 German fighters destroyed. German records confirmed 2 losses. On December 12, P-38s escorted bombers attacking El Aouina airfield. 8 Bf-109s attacked the bomber formation. The Lightnings intervened. When the engagement ended, 4 Messerschmitts had been shot down. Only 1 P-38 sustained damage, requiring it to make an emergency landing. The pattern repeated itself through December and into January of 1943. German pilots discovered that the P-38 could not be engaged using tactics developed for fighting the Bf-110. The Lightning was faster than the Zerstörer. It climbed better. Most significantly, it could turn. Schiess, who would eventually become the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring Lightning killer with 17 confirmed victories, spent months developing tactics specifically for fighting the P-38. He learned to exploit the Lightning's weaknesses. Early models had poor roll rate compared to single-engine fighters. The engines required careful management, and inexperienced pilots often failed to properly synchronize power settings during violent maneuvers. Most significantly, P-38s suffered from compressibility problems in high-speed dives. The controls would lock up if airspeed exceeded certain limits, sometimes fatally. But even as Schiess learned to kill Lightnings, he never stopped respecting their capabilities. Years after the war, in his combat memoirs, he would write that the P-38 pilot, who nearly shot him down during that first engagement over Tunisia, had taught him a crucial lesson: never underestimate an enemy based on preconceptions about what their aircraft should be capable of doing. The lesson spread slowly through the Luftwaffe. In North Africa, German pilots learned quickly because they fought Lightnings daily. In Europe, where the P-38 arrived in significant numbers only in late 1943, the learning curve proved steeper and bloodier. March 3, 1944. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Jenkins of the 55th Fighter Group led 38 P-38H models from England toward Berlin, the first American fighters to reach the German capital. The bombers Jenkins was assigned to escort turned back at Hamburg due to weather. Jenkins pressed on with his Lightnings, determined to reach Berlin and demonstrate that American fighters could penetrate the heart of the Reich. At 28,000 feet, 50 miles west of Berlin, Jenkins' formation encountered elements of Jagdgeschwader 3 and Jagdgeschwader 26. 30-plus Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s attacked the American formation. The engagement began with German pilots employing standard tactics: dive from above, attack from the rear, force the twin-engine fighters into defensive maneuvers where their weight would become a liability. The first diving attacks achieved mixed results. One P-38 took cannon hits and dropped out of formation, trailing smoke. Two more sustained damage but remained with the formation. Then the Lightnings turned into their attackers. At 28,000 feet, where the air was thin and cold, the P-38s maneuvered with agility that stunned the German pilots. Focke-Wulfs that had initiated diving attacks found themselves unable to escape as Lightning pilots pulled their aircraft around in pursuit. Bf 109s attempting boom and zoom tactics discovered that the Americans could follow them through vertical maneuvers that should have been impossible for twin-engine fighters. Jenkins himself shot down one Bf 109 and damaged another before his formation turned back toward England. The 55th Fighter Group lost 5 Lightnings not to aerial combat, but to flak damage, engine trouble, and fuel exhaustion. The Germans lost 4 confirmed aircraft in aerial combat, with 3 more damaged severely enough to require immediate repair. The after-action reports from German pilots revealed a pattern. Above 25,000 feet, the P-38 was not the easy target they had expected. Several pilots reported being unable to shake Lightning pursuit, despite performing maneuvers that should have left the heavier American aircraft wallowing. One Focke-Wulf 190 pilot, Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Müller of Jagdgeschwader 3, submitted a particularly detailed report. He had attacked a P-38 from above at 27,000 feet, standard diving attack procedure. The Lightning broke left, and Müller followed, confident his lighter fighter would turn inside the Americans' radius. "The Lightning turned harder than I expected," Müller wrote in his combat report. "I could not close to firing range. When I attempted to break off and dive away, the American pilot stayed with me through the dive entry. I only escaped by diving to 18,000 feet, where my aircraft's roll rate gave me an advantage." Müller's experience was not isolated. Through March and April of 1944, as more P-38 groups became operational over Germany, Luftwaffe pilots accumulated combat experience that contradicted their training. The twin-engine fighter they had been told to attack with confidence was proving difficult to kill, especially at high altitude. The reason for this reversal lay in performance characteristics that German intelligence had failed to fully appreciate. Above 25,000 feet, the Focke-Wulf 190's performance deteriorated significantly. The BMW 801 engine, optimized for low and medium altitudes, lost power as air density decreased. The radial engine's single-stage, two-speed supercharger could not maintain manifold pressure above 20,000 feet. German pilots had known about this limitation since the Focke-Wulf entered service in 1941. It was the price paid for the aircraft's excellent low-altitude performance. Below 20,000 feet, the 190 was faster, more maneuverable, and better armed than almost any Allied fighter. Above 25,000 feet, it became sluggish. Turn rate decreased. Climb rate fell off dramatically. The crisp roll response that made the 190 deadly at low altitude became heavy and unresponsive in the thin air. The P-38, by contrast, had been designed specifically for high-altitude interception. Its turbo-supercharged engines delivered nearly full power up to 30,000 feet. At 27,000 feet, where Müller had engaged his Lightning, the P-38's engines were still producing close to maximum output, while his BMW 801 had lost 30% of its sea-level power. This power advantage translated directly into maneuverability. Power-to-weight ratio matters more than absolute weight in turning combat. At high altitude, the P-38's superior power output gave it a turning radius comparable to and sometimes better than the heavier, underpowered Focke-Wulf 190. German fighter pilots were trained to think in terms of wing loading, wing area divided by aircraft weight, as the primary determinant of turning performance. By that metric, the 190 should have outturned the Lightning at any altitude. What the training manuals did not adequately address was how power-to-weight ratio affected sustained turn rate, especially at high altitude where power output varied dramatically between different engine types. A Focke-Wulf 190 at 27,000 feet, with its engine producing perhaps 65% of rated power, could not maintain altitude in a hard, sustained turn. The aircraft would bleed energy, losing airspeed and altitude until the pilot had to break off or risk stalling. A P-38 at the same altitude, with engines still producing 90% of rated power, could maintain altitude in a sustained turn while actually accelerating slightly. This meant that in practical combat, the Lightning could outturn the 190 above 25,000 feet, not because it had better instantaneous turn rate, it did not, but because it could sustain hard turns longer without losing energy. In a turning fight lasting more than one complete circle, the P-38's superior power-to-weight ratio at altitude gave it a decisive advantage. German pilots discovering this truth in combat faced a psychological challenge as difficult as the tactical one. Their training, their combat experience, their entire understanding of aerial warfare told them that twin-engine fighters could not dogfight with single-engine aircraft. Yet above 25,000 feet, the evidence of their own eyes contradicted everything they believed. Some pilots, like Schiess, adapted quickly. They learned to avoid turning combat with Lightnings at high altitude. They developed tactics that exploited the P-38's genuine weaknesses: poor roll rate, compressibility problems in dives, vulnerable cooling systems. They became successful Lightning killers by treating the American fighter as a genuine threat, requiring specific tactical responses. Other pilots, prisoners of doctrinal thinking, continued attempting to fight Lightnings using tactics developed for the Bf-110. They discovered too late that the Americans had not built another Zerstörer. They had created a genuinely effective high-altitude fighter that required completely new tactical approaches. April 8, 1944, Hauptmann Walter Nowotny stood before a briefing map at Jagdgeschwader 54 headquarters in Ludwigslust, Germany, studying intelligence reports that had arrived from Luftwaffe High Command the previous evening. Nowotny had accumulated 255 confirmed victories flying on the Eastern Front. He was one of the most decorated fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. He understood aerial combat as thoroughly as any pilot alive. The reports detailed recent encounters between Focke-Wulf 190s and P-38 Lightnings at altitudes above 25,000 feet. The pattern disturbed him. German pilots were reporting unexpected difficulty engaging the American twin-engine fighters at bomber escort altitudes. Some pilots described being outturned, Others reported inability to escape once a Lightning got on their tail at high altitude. WWII reviewed the technical specifications included in the intelligence packet. The P-38J model, now entering service in significant numbers over Germany, incorporated numerous improvements over earlier variants. Enhanced intercoolers housed in distinctive chin fairings beneath the engines, improved electrical systems, power-boosted ailerons that dramatically improved roll rate. Most significantly, the latest aircraft featured electrically actuated dive recovery flaps mounted under each wing, outboard of the engines. These dive flaps addressed the P-38's most serious weakness. Earlier models had suffered from compressibility problems in high-speed dives. Shock waves forming over the wings at transonic speeds caused the tail to become unresponsive, sometimes locking the aircraft into unrecoverable dives. The new dive flaps, when deployed during high-speed descent, changed the airflow pattern over the wing and restored elevator effectiveness. German pilots could no longer count on escaping by diving away at high speed. The intelligence summary concluded with tactical recommendations. Avoid prolonged turning combat with P-38s above 25,000 feet. Attack from advantageous positions but disengage if the American pilot maintains energy and position. Focus attacks on bomber formations rather than engaging Lightning escorts unless circumstances strongly favor German fighters. The recommendations amounted to an admission that at high altitude, the P-38 had become a dangerous opponent, requiring cautious tactics. WWII had faced the finest Soviet pilots flying the best aircraft Stalin's Air Force could field. He had fought against Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Airacobras. He understood implicitly what the intelligence reports were acknowledging explicitly. The Americans had solved the twin-engine fighter problem. Above 25,000 feet, the P-38 was not vulnerable. It was competitive. May 12, 1944. 29,000 feet above central Germany. Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group watched contrails 4,000 feet below his P-38J, 8 Focke-Wulf 190s, probably from Jagdgeschwader 11, climbing toward a formation of B-17 bombers 15 miles east. Johnson had been flying Lightnings for 7 months. He had accumulated 43 combat missions. He understood his aircraft's capabilities better than most pilots because he had taken time to learn every aspect of the P-38's performance envelope. He knew when to use combat flaps. He understood how to manage engine power during violent maneuvers. Most importantly, he had discovered that above 25,000 feet, his Lightning could outturn anything the Luftwaffe flew. He rolled inverted and pulled through into a steep diving attack, letting the P-38 accelerate to over 450 miles per hour. The Focke-Wulfs never saw him coming. Johnson closed to 300 yards behind the last aircraft in the German formation. His finger touched the trigger. 4 50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon erupted. The concentrated firepower stream converged on the Focke-Wulf's fuselage. Pieces flew off the German fighter's tail section. The 190 rolled violently left, trailing smoke. The remaining 7 German fighters broke formation. Standard defensive maneuver scatter, force the attacker to choose a single target, use superior numbers to attack from multiple angles. Johnson stayed with the damaged Focke-Wulf, firing another burst. The German pilot ejected. His parachute blossomed white against the dark landscape below. 2 Focke-Wulfs pulled hard right, attempting to get angles on Johnson. He deployed combat flaps and pulled his control stick back and right. The Lightning responded instantly, turning inside the German's turning radius. The lead Focke-Wulf pilot realized his mistake immediately. Instead of getting a shot at the American fighter's tail, he found himself looking at the P-38's nose. Johnson fired. Missed. Fired again. The second burst caught the Focke-Wulf's left wing root. The wing folded upward. The German fighter tumbled out of control. The remaining German pilots scattered. Johnson did not pursue. He climbed back toward the bomber formation, his primary mission to escort the B-17s. In 7 minutes of combat at 29,000 feet, he had destroyed 2 German fighters and damaged another without taking a single hit. His Lightning had performed flawlessly at an altitude where German doctrine said twin-engine fighters should be helpless. The engagement Johnson fought was not exceptional. By May of 1944, similar encounters were occurring daily across German airspace. P-38 pilots who understood their aircraft's capabilities were consistently achieving victories at high altitude, often against more numerous German forces. The key was understanding that the Lightning fought differently than single-engine fighters. It could not win instantaneous turn rate competitions at low altitude. It had slower roll rate than Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, but above 25,000 feet, it possessed advantages that transformed aerial combat dynamics. Sustained turn rate at altitude depended primarily on power-to-weight ratio. The Lightning's turbo-supercharged engines maintained power output where German engines lost effectiveness. In a prolonged turning fight at 27,000 feet, a P-38 could complete more turns per minute than a Focke-Wulf 190 because it could maintain airspeed while turning. The German fighter had to choose between maintaining airspeed or maintaining turn rate. The Lightning could do both. Energy retention was equally important. At high altitude, energy management determined success or failure in combat. The Lightning could accelerate from level flight to high speed more quickly than German fighters at altitude because its engines still produced near maximum output. After completing a high-speed diving attack, the P-38 could climb back to altitude faster than pursuing German fighters could follow. Most significantly, the Lightning's twin engines provided redundancy. Damage that would cripple a single-engine fighter might destroy one Lightning engine but leave the other functional. Numerous pilots returned to base flying on one engine, their survival enabled by the twin-boom design that German intelligence had initially identified as a fatal vulnerability. German pilots learning these lessons in combat filed increasingly detailed after-action reports through spring and summer of 1944. The cumulative picture that emerged from these reports forced Luftwaffe tactical planners to fundamentally revise their assessment of the P-38 threat. June 14, 1944. Major Heinz Baer, commander of Jagdgeschwader 3, read the latest tactical bulletin distributed by Luftwaffe Fighter Command. The document outlined revised procedures for engaging P-38 formations at high altitude. The recommendations were clear and sobering. Avoid engagement above 25,000 feet unless numerical or tactical advantage is overwhelming. Attack bombers as primary objective. Disengage from Lightning escorts if they maintain energy advantage. Use diving attacks only if sufficient altitude advantage exists to avoid pursuit. Do not attempt sustained turning combat with P-38s at altitude above 22,000 feet. Baer, who had destroyed 220 enemy aircraft across multiple theaters, understood the implications. The Luftwaffe was acknowledging that German fighters could no longer freely engage American escorts at bomber altitudes. The P-38, flying at its design altitude, had achieved parity with, and in some circumstances, superiority over German single-engine fighters. The mathematics of this transformation were written in production figures and loss ratios that German intelligence studied with growing concern. In April of 1944, 8th Air Force P-38s flew approximately 14,000 sorties over Europe. They claimed 97 German aircraft destroyed against 41 Lightning losses to all causes, including flak, mechanical failure, and aerial combat. The exchange ratio, while not as favorable as the P-51 Mustang achieved, still favored the Americans significantly. More troubling for German planners was the psychological impact. Luftwaffe pilots who had been told to treat twin-engine fighters as easy targets were discovering through painful experience that the Lightning required the same tactical respect as any single-engine fighter. This forced a mental adjustment that some pilots managed successfully, while others paid for their preconceptions with their lives. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation in German tactical thinking about the P-38 was not universal. Some veteran pilots adapted quickly to the reality that the Lightning was dangerous at high altitude. Others, committed to doctrinal beliefs about twin-engine fighter vulnerability, continued attempting to engage Lightnings using tactics that had worked against the Bf-110 and continued suffering losses as a result. Oberleutnant Willi Reschke of Jagdgeschwader 27 exemplified the adaptive approach. Reschke had 31 confirmed victories when he encountered P-38s for the first time in March of 1944. His initial engagement, fought at 26,000 feet, nearly proved fatal. He attacked a Lightning from behind and above, standard procedure. The American pilot broke hard left and pulled his P-38 around in a climbing turn that Reschke's Messerschmitt Bf-109 Gustav could not match. Only superior roll rate saved Reschke from being shot down during his first encounter with the type. After that engagement, Reschke studied the Lightning carefully. He interviewed other pilots who had fought P-38s successfully. He analyzed the aircraft's strengths and weaknesses. By May, he had developed a tactical approach that worked. Attack from directly above in a near-vertical dive, fire one burst, and continue diving away without attempting to turn. Use superior roll rate to evade if the Lightning pursues. Never engage in sustained turning combat above 23,000 feet. Following these principles, Reschke shot down 4 P-38s between May and August of 1944. He survived the war with 47 confirmed victories. When interviewed decades later, he credited his survival partly to learning to respect the Lightning's high-altitude capabilities. Other pilots were less fortunate. Lieutenant Werner Goeth of Jagdgeschwader 3 had been taught that twin-engine fighters were vulnerable in turning combat. On June 21, 1944, he attacked a P-38 formation at 28,000 feet. Goeth attempted to turn with a Lightning piloted by First Lieutenant James Morris of the 20th Fighter Group. The American pilot deployed combat flaps and pulled his Lightning around inside Goeth's turning radius. Morris fired one long burst. Goeth's Focke-Wulf 190 exploded. Goeth did not survive. The pattern repeated itself across the summer of 1944. German pilots who adapted to the reality of the Lightning's high-altitude capabilities survived and occasionally achieved victories. Those who clung to preconceptions about twin-engine fighter vulnerability died. The Luftwaffe as an institution adapted slowly, hindered by fuel shortages, pilot training time reductions, and the general deterioration of Germany's strategic position. By September of 1944, most P-38 groups in the 8th Air Force had converted to P-51 Mustangs. The Lightning's replacement was not primarily due to combat performance issues. The Mustang simply offered superior range, was easier to maintain, cost half as much to produce, and required less pilot training time to master. But during the Lightning's year of heavy combat over Germany, from autumn 1943 through summer 1944, it had forced the Luftwaffe to completely revise its tactical doctrine regarding twin-engine fighters. The 15th Air Force in Italy retained P-38s longer than the 8th Air Force. Operating primarily over southeastern Europe and the Balkans, Lightning squadrons continued flying bomber escort missions through the end of the war. German pilots in that theatre learned the same lessons their colleagues in the West had absorbed. Above 25,000 feet, the P-38 was dangerous. Engage it cautiously or not at all. August 7, 1944. Oberstleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, commander of Jagdgeschwader 7, returned from a mission over southern Germany. He had engaged P-38s from the 82nd Fighter Group at 27,000 feet. The encounter had been indecisive. Steinhoff had damaged one Lightning but failed to achieve a confirmed kill. 2 of his pilots had been shot down. Both had ejected successfully, but the loss ratio troubled him. Steinhoff had 176 confirmed victories. He had fought against every major Allied fighter type. In a post-war interview, he would state that he considered the Lightning the most dangerous Allied fighter he faced. Not because it was superior in every performance category, it was not, but because its combination of range, firepower, high-altitude performance, and survivability made it uniquely threatening. A Spitfire or Mustang might shoot you down in a dogfight, Steinhoff noted, but the P-38 could be anywhere, strike from any direction, absorb your return fire, and escape to fight again. That versatility made it more dangerous than single-engine fighters with superior performance in specific parameters. The technical developments that had transformed the P-38 from a flawed early war design into an effective high-altitude fighter were documented in detailed engineering reports that circulated within Lockheed and Army Air Force's technical divisions. The improvements that made the P-38J and L models combat effective came from systematic problem-solving rather than revolutionary innovations. The intercooler redesign was typical. Early P-38s housed intercoolers in the wing leading edges. This arrangement proved vulnerable to combat damage and prone to overheating. The P-38J relocated intercoolers to positions beneath the engines in distinctive chin fairings. This increased drag slightly but dramatically improved cooling efficiency and reduced vulnerability. The improvement cost less than 1% of maximum speed but made the engines significantly more reliable at high altitude. The dive recovery flaps represented a more sophisticated solution. Lockheed engineers, working with National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics researchers, discovered that shock waves forming over the wing at high speeds moved the center of pressure aft, creating an uncontrollable nose-down pitching moment. The dive flaps, when deployed, changed the shock wave pattern and restored elevator effectiveness. Pilots could now dive at high speed, pursue German fighters through steep descents, and recover safely. Power-boosted ailerons addressed the Lightning's slow roll rate. Hydraulic actuators assisted pilot control inputs, dramatically improving roll response. The modification added approximately 50 pounds to aircraft weight, but improved roll rate by over 40% at high speeds. German pilots who had counted on superior roll rate to escape Lightning pursuit discovered that later models could follow rolling maneuvers much more effectively than earlier variants. These incremental improvements, combined with the P-38's inherent high-altitude power advantage, transformed it into a genuinely competitive fighter above 25,000 feet. German pilots, who had laughed at intelligence photographs showing the strange twin-boom fighter, learned through combat experience to treat it with the same tactical respect they accorded Mustangs and Thunderbolts. The learning process cost the Luftwaffe aircraft and pilots it could not afford to lose. By summer of 1944, Germany faced overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. Fuel shortages limited training time for replacement pilots. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than training units could produce replacements. Every aircraft lost to faulty tactical doctrine was one the Luftwaffe could not replace. The P-38's role in this attrition was significant but not decisive. Mustangs destroyed more German aircraft, Thunderbolts flew more sorties. But the Lightning, during its year of heavy combat over Germany, helped teach the Luftwaffe an expensive lesson. American aircraft design and manufacturing capability had produced a fighter that could not be dismissed based on conventional assumptions about twin-engine vulnerability. The strange-looking aircraft with two engines and twin booms had proven that unconventional design could succeed if it properly exploited the advantages its configuration provided. October 12, 1944. Lieutenant Klaus Fischer, the pilot whose encounter had opened this story, sat in a briefing room at a dispersed field near Hamburg. He had survived 7 more months of combat since that March engagement. He had shot down 2 P-38s, both at altitudes below 20,000 feet, where his Focke-Wulf maintained performance advantages. He had learned not to engage Lightnings at high altitude unless circumstances strongly favored him. He had watched less experienced pilots ignore that lesson and die as a result. The briefing officer was reviewing procedures for the day's mission. American bombers were expected over Western Germany. Escort would likely include Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and possibly Lightnings. Standard tactical doctrine applied. Attack bombers as primary objective. Avoid prolonged engagement with escorts unless situation favors German forces. Disengage if enemy maintains energy advantage. Fischer understood what these procedures represented. The Luftwaffe was acknowledging that it could no longer dictate the terms of aerial combat over Germany. Allied fighters, including the twin-engine P-38 that doctrine had once dismissed as vulnerable, now controlled German airspace. The mathematics of aerial warfare had shifted decisively against Germany. Superior Allied production, better trained pilots, more reliable engines, and greater numerical strength combined to make German defensive efforts increasingly futile. The P-38 had been one element in this transformation. Not the most important element, that distinction belonged to the Mustang with its combination of range, speed, and maneuverability. But the Lightning had played its role. It had proven that American engineering could produce aircraft that challenged German tactical assumptions. It had forced the Luftwaffe to revise doctrine and develop new procedures. Most significantly, it had demonstrated that twin engines were not automatically a liability in aerial combat. Power, design, and pilot skill could overcome weight penalties if the aircraft was designed intelligently for its mission. By November of 1944, German fighter pilots, who survived long enough to accumulate combat experience against P-38s, had learned to respect the type's capabilities. The Lightning was no longer dismissed as an easy target. Intelligence bulletins acknowledged it as a dangerous opponent at high altitude. Tactical manuals recommended cautious engagement procedures. The aircraft that had violated every principle of German fighter doctrine had proven effective despite its unconventional design. The cost of this lesson was measured in aircraft lost and pilots killed. Exact figures are difficult to establish with certainty. German loss records for late 1943 through mid-1944 are incomplete. American claims often exceeded actual German losses due to multiple pilots claiming the same aircraft. But available evidence suggests that German fighters lost approximately 200 aircraft in combat with P-38s during the type's primary service period over Germany. Perhaps 150 of these losses occurred at altitudes above 20,000 feet, where German doctrine had predicted the Lightning would be most vulnerable. These losses represented experienced pilots the Luftwaffe could not replace. By late 1944, training time for German fighter pilots had been reduced to as little as 150 flight hours, compared to over 300 hours earlier in the war. New pilots arriving at operational units often had minimal experience in high-altitude combat. They were taught tactical procedures developed by experienced pilots, but lacked the skill to execute those procedures effectively under combat stress. When these inexperienced pilots encountered P-38s at high altitude, the results were often fatal. The Lightning might not be the most maneuverable fighter in the sky, but it was maneuverable enough to kill pilots who underestimated it. The twin-engine configuration that had seemed so obviously vulnerable turned out to provide advantages that German doctrine had not anticipated. The final accounting of the P-38's combat record in Europe showed approximately 10,370 aircraft built of all variants. Roughly 3,000 served in the European and Mediterranean theatres at various times between 1942 and 1945. These aircraft flew approximately 130,000 sorties. They claimed approximately 427 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. They lost approximately 550 Lightnings to all causes, including aerial combat, flak, mechanical failure, and accidents. These statistics placed the P-38's effectiveness below that of the Mustang and roughly equal to that of the Thunderbolt in terms of exchange ratios. The Lightning was not the best American fighter in Europe, but it was effective, particularly at the high altitudes where German doctrine had predicted it would be most vulnerable. That effectiveness forced German tactical planners to revise assumptions about twin-engine fighters that had been validated by 3 years of combat experience. The psychological impact was perhaps more significant than the material losses. German pilots had entered the war confident in the superiority of their aircraft, tactics, and training. By late 1944, they were defending German cities against overwhelming Allied air armadas that included types like the P-38 aircraft that violated German design principles but worked effectively anyway. This contradiction between doctrine and reality undermined confidence in German technical and tactical leadership. December 16, 1944. The last large-scale engagement between P-38s and German fighters over Germany occurred during the initial stages of the Ardennes offensive. Luftwaffe fighters, scraping together fuel reserves for one massive operation, launched attacks against Allied tactical airfields and bomber formations. P-38 groups engaged German forces at various altitudes across Western Germany and the Low Countries. By this point in the war, the engagements followed predictable patterns. German pilots attempted diving attacks or boom and zoom tactics that exploited superior roll rates. Lightning pilots used combat flaps and sustained turns to counter German maneuvers. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, P-38s generally held their own or better. Below 20,000 feet, German fighters maintained slight advantages but could not achieve the decisive superiority that doctrine had predicted. The day's fighting cost the Luftwaffe approximately 120 aircraft. Perhaps 20 of these fell to P-38 pilots. The Lightnings lost 8 aircraft to aerial combat. By any measure, the exchange ratio favored the Americans. More significantly, the Luftwaffe's desperate fuel expenditure achieved no strategic result. Allied air superiority remained unchallenged. The P-38, along with Mustangs and Thunderbolts, continued controlling airspace over Europe. German fuel shortages grounded most fighter units for extended periods. The few engagements that occurred followed the patterns established over the previous year. P-38s were dangerous at high altitude. German fighters could kill them through skilled tactics and favorable positioning, but the days of dismissing twin-engine fighters as easy prey were long past. Franz Schiess, the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring Lightning killer, survived the war. He would write extensively about his encounters with P-38s in post-war memoirs. His assessment was measured and respectful. The Lightning had been a dangerous opponent that required careful tactical approach. Its twin engines provided redundancy. Its high-altitude performance exceeded that of German fighters above 25,000 feet. Its concentrated nose armament delivered devastating firepower. Pilots who treated it carelessly died. Those who respected its capabilities and exploited its weaknesses could achieve victories. Johannes Steinhoff also survived, though badly burned in a crash during the war's final days. In post-war interviews, he would maintain that the P-38 was the most dangerous Allied fighter he faced because of its versatility and survivability. This assessment, coming from a pilot who had fought against every major Allied type, represented professional acknowledgement of the Lightning's effectiveness. Other German aces who encountered P-38s expressed similar views in post-war writings and interviews. The consensus was clear. The twin-engine fighter that had initially been dismissed as unsuitable for aerial combat had proven genuinely effective, particularly at high altitudes where its turbo-supercharged engines maintained power output that German engines could not match. The lesson the Luftwaffe learned about the P-38 extended beyond specific tactical details. German pilots discovered that American engineering approaches differed fundamentally from German design philosophy. Germany favored incremental improvements to proven designs. America was willing to pursue unconventional solutions if those solutions provided tactical advantages. The P-38 embodied this approach. It violated conventional wisdom about fighter design. It was larger, heavier, and more complex than traditional fighters. It cost twice as much to produce as single-engine types. But it provided capabilities that single-engine fighters could not match: range sufficient to escort bombers deep into Germany, redundancy that brought damaged aircraft home, high-altitude performance that exceeded German fighters, concentrated firepower that destroyed targets with short bursts. These advantages came at costs. The Lightning required more pilot training time than simpler fighters. It was more difficult to maintain in field conditions. It suffered from problems compressibility, cockpit heating, engine reliability that took years to solve. But by late 1944, when improved J and L models reached operational units in numbers, most of these problems had been addressed. The result was a fighter that worked effectively in its design role despite not being the best aircraft in any single performance category. German pilots who survived the war and later immigrated to America often encountered P-38s at air shows and museums. Their reactions revealed the respect that combat experience had taught them. Franz Stiegler, who had shot down 7 Lightnings, visited the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Ohio decades after the war. He spent nearly an hour examining a restored P-38J, studying the nose-mounted weapons, the twin booms, the tricycle landing gear. When asked what he thought of the aircraft, Stiegler responded that it was one of the most innovative fighter designs of the war. He acknowledged that German engineers had been too conservative, too committed to conventional layouts. The Americans had been willing to try something radical, and it had worked. Not perfectly, no aircraft was perfect, but well enough to be effective in combat. This acknowledgement represented a complete reversal from the initial German assessment. The strange twin-boom fighter that intelligence officers had dismissed in late 1943 had proven its worth through combat performance that could not be denied. Above 25,000 feet, in the thin, freezing air where bomber battles were fought, the P-38 could outturn Focke-Wulf 190s. This simple fact shattered assumptions that had been considered inviolate. The story of the P-38 in Europe was ultimately a story about the danger of rigid tactical thinking. German doctrine, based on extensive combat experience, held that twin-engine fighters were vulnerable in aerial combat. This doctrine was correct for every twin-engine fighter design except one. The Americans had solved problems that defeated German, British, and Soviet engineers. They created a twin-engine fighter that could succeed in roles where conventional wisdom said success was impossible. The cost of learning this lesson was paid in German pilots lost, aircraft destroyed, and tactical opportunities missed. By the time the Luftwaffe fully understood what the P-38 represented, Allied air superiority was complete. The skies over Germany belonged to American and British aircraft. The twin-engine fighter that German pilots had once laughed at was destroying German transportation networks, industrial targets, and defensive positions with near impunity. In the final analysis, the P-38 Lightning accomplished exactly what its designers intended. It provided American air forces with a fighter capable of missions impossible for single-engine aircraft of its era. Its unconventional design, initially ridiculed by German intelligence, proved revolutionary rather than foolish. The twin engines that seemed like fatal weakness turned out to be the Lightning's greatest strength. They provided redundancy, power, range, and high-altitude performance that transformed aerial combat tactics. German aces learned this truth through the most unforgiving teacher available combat experience. Some lessons can only be learned through fighting. For Luftwaffe pilots in 1944, the P-38 Lightning taught one of the war's most important lessons. Never underestimate an enemy based on preconceptions about what their weapons should be capable of achieving. The twin-boom fighter that violated every principle of German fighter design doctrine proved devastatingly effective in the hands of skilled American pilots. The mathematics of this effectiveness were written not in theoretical performance specifications, but in combat records that could not be denied. By war's end, no German pilot dismissed the P-38 as an easy kill. They had learned to respect the Lightning's capabilities through the most convincing evidence possible survival. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.